Hi there. In this episode, the first of 2 episodes, I'm going mixerless. This episode will be about how I'm going to do this and actually doing it in this episode. I'll have to significantly rewire my studio, do some setup both in Cubase and in the RME TotalMix app, and I'm going to show you everything I have to do to make my studio functional without a mixer. And I have quite a few items to connect, so it should be interesting. I'm pretty sure I have all the devices and all the cables I will need. After 30 days or so, I'll publish a second episode about how it went. I'll talk about the good, the bad, and of course the ugly. Everything you might want to know about my experience, so it might be able to help you if you decide to go mixerless. The plan is not to go back to a mixer ever again. Those are the broad strokes. I'm going to index this episode heavily so you can quickly find what you need. If you're here for help, use the index. If you're interested in the entire process, consider watching everything. Let's start with a block diagram overview of the physical connections I will need to make in order to go mixerless. Here's an overview of what I'm going to be doing in this video to go mixerless. I have 4 primary keyboards: Kronos X88, XV88, QS7, and a wave station. I'm going to take a stereo signal out of each of these keyboards. That's a total of 8 signals. I'm going to feed them to analog in 1 through 8 on a MOTU 2408 Mark II. It's going to convert them to ADAT, and that's going to go into inputs 1 through 8 on the RME. Next, I have 4 more sources: a Juno 106, an Akai X80, a wave station, and an XV5080. Technically, the AX80 is mono, but I'm going to run it through a DEP5, which will give me a stereo output. That's 8 more sources. They're going to go into the analog inputs of a MOTU 2408 Mark I, number 1 of 2. It's going to convert them to ADAT, and that's going to go into the RME through channels 9 through 16. Then I have a twin track preamp. That's going to come into the RME through the analog inputs 9 and 10. Those are Nutrix connectors on the front panel, and I'm going to use an XLR connector for each of those inputs. Next up, we have the Pod XT Pro. You can see that this is bi-directional. There's an arrow at each end. That's going to come in through AES. Because it's bi-directional, I can technically use it as an effects loop, and I can reamp through the Pod XT Pro. Technically, I'm not miking a speaker, but it's modeling reamping, but it's something anyway. As far as outputs are concerned, to get to my speakers, I'm coming out of ADAT 1 through 8 on the RME. That's going to go into a MOTU 2408 Mark I, the second of 2. It's going to convert those 8 channels to analog. 6 of those channels are going to go to 6 speakers for 5.1 surround, and 2 of them are going to go to my headphone distribution amp, a Rolls RA62. My music PC is using Cubase, and that is connected to the RME through a USB connection. I'm also using TotalMix, which is a requirement with the RME, and I'll be going through TotalMix in nauseating detail in a little while. I have 3 hardware effects that are looped into my DAW, and so they are using analog outputs 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8, and also inputs 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8. That's how they're looped into the RME. I'm also using Cubase with delay compensation so that everything in Cubase stays locked in time, so none of the audio gets shifted. Last but not least, I have a center hookup that I created. It's just a stereo connection that I can put a keyboard in the center of the room if I need to. There's also MIDI in and out there, and a standard IEC connector. That's the overview and the broad strokes. Now let's see if it's all going to work. Now let's look at my solution for tactile control. The advantage of a mixer is that I can grab the master fader and the channel faders, and it's effortless to change levels. Also on the mixer, I have presets for selecting pairs of speakers so that I can be working on the Chronos, which is behind me, and have a stereo image. Or I can work on the XV88 and still be listening to a stereo image. RME has an app called TotalMix. Other manufacturers have their own apps. I believe the one for MOTU is called AudioDesk, or at least it was when I was using MOTU devices. They allow you to set up signal routings within the interface. I've been using this app ever since I purchased the RME UFX. It runs in the background and makes everything work. Mostly that means setting up routing configurations using TotalMix on the PC. I will be using an old iPad to replace my mixer's physical controls. Technically, the iPad is not running TotalMix. It's just a remote control for it. TotalMix looks essentially identical on the iPad screen to how it looks on the PC screen, so there should be very little for me to learn that is new. I'll be touching the iPad screen to move faders up and down when needed. I'm hoping to program TotalMix snapshots to allow me to select speaker sets just like when I press buttons on the mixer. From everything I know about the app by reading the manual, I should be able to do this. We'll find out together in this episode if I'm right about that. When I first tried TotalMix about 14 years ago, I initially found it confusing. Once I got past the "how does it work" curve, I realized how powerful it truly is. I'm anticipating that I will be able to set up TotalMix to do everything the mixer does for me now. That's going to be a lot of routing programming, and even though I will be remote controlling TotalMix from the iPad, I can program it inside the PC with a mouse and the 40-inch monitor you see behind me. That will be a lot easier than doing it on a relatively small iPad screen. This is really the core of this episode, and the core of going mixerless for me and for practically anyone. I've already done the math. I know I have enough inputs and output channels on my audio interface. The big question is, will my workflow be essentially the same? I don't want it to change or be degraded. I'm thinking it will be essentially the same. I don't touch the mixer that often. I initially set it up years ago, and all I do now is select speaker sets by pressing buttons. I rarely change the master volume and channel fader levels. The mixer is a more engaged process when recording a pop song and I have other people in the room. A lot less so when I'm composing score. One thing I should say is that RME makes the ARC hardware remote control for the UFX, which lists for $179. It comes in black and silver, and you probably know what my preference would be. It's a tabletop device that allows remote control of major TotalMix functions. I may consider getting one depending on how the iPad control works out. Technically, the iPad allows a higher level of control, but the ARC remote control gives you more of the tactile experience. The good thing is that you can use both at the same time. Now it's time to start wiring connections, and then I'll program TotalMix to see if it's actually going to work. This is the first of 3 MOTU 2408 audio interfaces. I'm going to be using this interface in standalone conversion mode. I'm going to be converting analog signals into ADAT. I'm actually going to use this MOTU 2408 Mark II to convert my main keyboard signals into ADAT. The advantage of the Mark II is that it has 1/4-inch analog inputs on the back. The Mark I uses RCA. We are going to be using 2 MOTU 2408 Mark I's to do other conversions, and I'll talk about those when we get there. It's pretty easy to set this up. We have 4 lines of parameters. We select those lines by pressing the select button, and you'll see the little flashing light move among those lines. Don't worry about meter. Don't worry about bounce, but make sure it's on 1-2 to 1-2. We do need to worry about the source. To select the source from any one of these options here, we press the set button. Currently, we're converting from analog. So that's our source, analog. And I have my Kronos, my XV88, the QS7, and the wave station coming into the back on those 1/4" inputs. And I'm going to send that out on ADAT. I'm going to press the set button so you can see it cycle through the options. And we're back to analog. Next, I need to set my clock. So I'm going to press the select, goes up to clock. I have it set for external 48 kilohertz. By pressing the set button, it will cycle through the other options. That's all there is to using this in standalone conversion. I have a whole video episode dedicated to the 2408 Mark I, Mark II, and Mark III, where I tell you in nauseating detail how you can use these interfaces to do single directional conversion. It's a great way to add 8 analog inputs to your audio interface if it has an ADAT connector on it. This is the left side of the rack from the rear, which would be the right side of the rack from the front. I'm zooming in here on the 2408 Mark II, this unit right here. I'm going to be using this top row of inputs for my primary keyboards. The Kronos is going to go on 1 and 2. The XV88 is going to go on 3 and 4. QS7 on 5 and 6. And the wave station on 7 and 8. These are the ADAT connectors on the back of the MOTU 2408 Mark II. Remember, I'm doing single directional conversion, basically standalone conversion of the 8 analog ins to ADAT out. There are 3 banks of ADAT on this 2408. Bank C, Bank B, and over here Bank A, which I already have connected to the RME. It's a bidirectional connection because the RME is providing sync, and it's doing that through the ADAT connector coming in. On the ADAT connector coming out, we're sending out our 8 analog converted channels. I want to give you a quick overview of the other 2 MOTU interfaces. They're both MOTU 2408 Mark Is. The top unit is doing essentially what the MOTU 2408 Mark II is doing. It's converting analog, that's the source, to ADAT. And I have obviously the clock set exactly the same, external 48 kilohertz. While this one is converting analog to ADAT, the one down here is converting ADAT back to analog. This is my output device. This is coming essentially from the RME into this device here where it's converting it to analog, and I get 8 analog outputs. I'm using 6 of those for 5.1 surround sound, and the other 2 are feeding a Rolls headphone amp. This is the front panel of my RME interface. I'm using analog inputs 9, 10, 11, and 12 here. I'm also using MIDI port number 2. I was hoping to use this large volume knob as a knob I could just grab and affect the overall volume, but I don't think it's going to work because I'm setting up the RME with some weird setup because of the 5.1 surround sound. This is the back panel of the RME interface. It's pretty full. With only 3 exceptions, every port has something plugged in. Here are the 8 inputs. Here are the 8 outputs. This is AES EBU, in and out. There's 16 channels of ADAT right here. Let me move this cable down, give you a better look right here. Word clock in is not connected, but word clock out is. I have that BNC cable running to the MOTU devices. It's hard to see over here, but there is a remote input here for the remote control device I talked about earlier. There's also a FireWire connection. I'm not using that because I'm using USB. We have MIDI in and out, and then there's power. That's a lot of cables. Time to set up TotalMix to route all the signals and set up snapshots to control my speakers and image position. Here we are in TotalMix. I'm going to apologize up front and tell you this is a little bit tricky to understand, but I'm going to make it as easy as possible as I can for you. Also, as I put in some text at the beginning, I am suffering from a little bit of a cold, so I may sound a little bit nasally. But here we go. Let's start with the title bar here, and you can see that I'm using my Mixerless beta. This is my beta test. We have some options here. I'm not going to go through everything, but I'm going to give you an overview. If you're an RME aficionado, there's going to be nothing new for you. If you're a user of RME products, you may find this helpful. And even if you don't use RME products and you're thinking about going mixerless, there still could be a lot of pertinent information here because I'm going to be covering concepts of routing and how you would make that work. Let's go through the menu really quickly. As far as file is concerned, the most important thing here is loading and saving a workspace. This entire screen is a workspace, and that's what I primarily deal with. As far as functions go, we have a mixer view and we have a matrix view, which just shows you one line here with another line here, so you can see where all the named items are going and what their output value is or their input value is. And of course, this is dB. Here we have the options page, and there's a lot in the preferences you might want to look at and see how you want to set up your interface. There's also a lot in the settings. And this is where you'll need to come if you need to set up external devices. There's a lot of places that you may need to go to set up some external devices, like setting up an iPad to use it with your RME. I'm going to throw up a picture of the RME on my iPad to give you an idea of what it looks like. Now, you should be aware that my iPad's a really old iPad. It's a Gen 2. It's from like 10 years ago. So it's running software from RME that is about 6 years old, 4 to 6 years old. The newer stuff has some newer functionality to it, but essentially the look of it is pretty much the same. On the window here, I can change the size of my my window that I'm looking at, so I can make it really small. I can also make it really big, but I kind of lose a little bit on the bottom, so I don't use that option very much. You can use it in conjunction with 2-row, and what that does is removes this middle row of sliders or faders here. And I'm going to be explaining what all these are. So if we put it on 2-row, it's pretty big and it's all on one screen. For 3 rows, I like to use the size that's just one underneath that, 200%. We also have a help button here we can click on, and you can find out a lot about this device and you can get some help with it. Essentially, it's a help manual that you can read. Let's get started on this screen. Now, I've already set up everything. Well, almost everything. I have the speakers set up so that I can choose sets of stereo speakers out of my 4 main speakers in my surround sound system, so that I can have the speakers that are to either side of my composing area when I'm sitting at my Kronos and I'm composing, or when I'm sitting at the 3-tiered rack and I have the XV88. And I'm going to show you how I did that. What I have not done yet is set up true 5.1 surround yet, and I'll get that done eventually, but this is Still a pretty complex setup for a lot of people. You'll see that I already have custom names on everything. And you can see on the inputs here, and these are my hardware inputs, I have the names of what I'm bringing in. Now there should be 30 hardware inputs, because that's how many inputs I told you there are on the RME UFX. Let's count them. We have some mono channels and we have some stereo channels. This is a stereo channel, this is a mono channel, and it tells you. So if we count them, there should be 30. 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. Just like I told you. A handy feature in this software is we can go over here and we can click on names, and you'll see that these names that I have custom entered will go back to their defaults. And you can see that these relate to the actual hardware inputs on the device. The analog inputs, which are 1 through 12, the AES digital, both left and right, and my 16 channels of ADAT. I can click this names again, it's a toggle, and I get my custom names back. If I need to change a name, I just double click on it, and I get a dialog box, and then I can just type a new name, and then click OK. So these are my hardware inputs. The next line is my software playback. This is what's coming out of Cubase for me. My main output is this one right here. This is my stereo master in Cubase. I'm sending it right here. Take a look at that, and I'm going to click on the names and you'll see what it changes to. It changes to ADAT 1 and 2. Also coming out of Cubase, I have my effects loops, the PCM81, the MPX 500, and the Voice Live Rack. These are stereo channels. Just for fun, I'm going to go back up to the inputs here, and I'm going to click on this wrench. If you're in England, you might call it a spanner, mate. So here we are, we click on that, and we can see that it's a stereo channel. I can click on this, and it will turn it into 2 mono channels. If I go back in there again and click on it, it goes back to being stereo. When we're in there, we can also click on EQ, and we have EQ that we can set. We also have some dynamics, so we can have our compressor. If you say had a drum set always connected to some channels, you might want to set this up, or have a preset, and then maybe you just tweak it a little bit every time you record. So all these are available while you're in here. It's a toggle, and we can just click on the one that's open and it will close it again. We also have this little button down here, and this will just make it a thin channel so it doesn't take up as much space on the screen. Let's go down to our hardware outputs. I told you that there were 30 inputs and there are 30 outputs. Let's count them to see if there really are 30 of them. The PCM81 is a stereo channel, so we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. So we have 30 output channels. I have my speakers set up right here. Take a look at these names as I change them up here. They're going to ADATs 9 through 16. If you've watched the entire video, that you know that my output is going to a MOTU 2408. It's an ADAT connection to the RME, essentially coming out of the RME and going into that MOTU, and then it's converting it to 8 channels. And those 8 channels are my speakers. I have a front left speaker, a front right, a rear left, a rear right, a center, an LFE sub. These two here I have going to my Rolls hardware distribution amp. It's a 6-channel headphone amp. Just when I have more people in here, every once in a while I do a small ensemble, and it's important to have that many headphone outputs. Let's talk about how you get signals in and out of the device. Now, this does work in conjunction with Cubase to some degree, but let's talk about direct monitoring. I have the Chronos turned on right now, so let me just, you can see as I'm playing it, you can see the signal coming in on the inputs. And it's going to these outputs right here. So let's click on one of these outputs. This is the front left speaker. And if you look up here, you'll see all the left channels are up. All the way through. And that's how you get it to go to that channel on the output. If I take this and I move it down, you can see I've lost my signal. You may not really hear it because I'm not recording the audio separately. I'm recording it on a portable Tascam for just voiceover purposes. But as I put this back up, you can hear it. Now we can double click on this and it'll set it at 0. We can double click on it again and it'll go to -infinity. And that's how you set this up. So with my front left speaker, I have all the left channels up and all the right channels down. And guess what happens if I click on the front right speaker? It's going to be reversed. Now all the right channels are up. If I click on the rear left speaker, nothing is coming out. And that would be the same for the other speakers as well. I'm only sending to the front left and front right. And that's because I have the snapshot set to front. If you've seen the studio tour, you know that I'm sitting at the Chronos with a set of monitors in front of me. And that's usually where I sit. So that would be my front left and front right speaker. You know that in the second tour that I did in that video, I showed you that I had a 3-tier rack that would be to my left. Let's go ahead and activate that speaker group, and you'll see things will change. Now the front left is receiving the right signal because I've rotated my position counterclockwise 90 degrees. The rear left becomes my left speaker. So when I click on that, you'll see all the left channels will be active on that particular speaker. That's how simple it is to set up. Now it does take a little bit of time to do it all, but it's worth it. I also have some other speaker groups set up. I have the modules, which would be on my right. Instead of rotating to my left to go to the keyboard rack, I would rotate from my main position to the right, and that would be those two speakers, or I can have it on the rear set of speakers. And that would be handy for when I'm facing the camera and I'm playing something. But usually I'm wearing headphones, but I wanted to set it up just to have it. I did add this one down here, Panic. And when I click that, you'll notice that everything goes to 0. It doesn't matter. I didn't set the effects loops to 0 because that doesn't really matter. But when I was setting everything up, every once in a while things would get out of sync as far as the MOTUs were concerned, and they would switch back to 44.1 kilohertz, and you get all that digital noise coming through on the speakers, and it's loud. So I had my little panic button there, but I can go back to my front set of speakers just by clicking on this, and here they are, ready to go again. I want to briefly talk about my effects loops. Now I will probably do a separate episode on effects loops. And what I mean by that is bringing hardware effects and looping them into your DAW. So you have to do this in essentially 3 stages. You have to connect everything up with wires, obviously with your cables. Then you have to go into the RME here and set up the effects loops, and I'll show you that in just a moment. Then you have to go into Cubase and set that up too. And we'll be going to Cubase after I do this particular portion of the video, and you'll see what I did there as far as the effects loops. I'm not going to go over it in a ton of detail here, but I'll go over it in some detail, and it might be enough for people to put stuff together. But in another episode, I will do a lot of detail. Coming out of Cubase is this particular row here. These are my software playback. And coming out of Cubase, I have the PCM81 send, the MPX 500 send, and the VL rack send. So think of these basically as sends. Those are going into the hardware outputs. The PCM81 goes to the PCM81. So if I click on this, you can see only the PCM81 goes to the PCM81. Only the MPX 500 goes to the MPX 500. And only the VL rack goes to the VL rack. So these signals are being sent from Cubase, because these are my software playback, from those outputs, which is a logical source, to physical source here, where they come out of the hardware outputs. From there, I have them plugged in to, say, the VL rack or the PCM81. They come out of the PCM81 physically in the real world, and then they go back to the inputs. Remember, this is the hardware inputs of the RME. And that's how you create the effects loop. Time to go ahead and take a look at Cubase and make this even more confusing. Here we are in Cubase. Before we get started, I want to tell you this is not going to be an in-depth set it up type of video portion here. This video is already too long. What I am going to show you is how to do everything in brief terms so that you can set it up. You should pretty much already be familiar with your DAW, and if you have Cubase, with Cubase. This will just be augmenting that knowledge so that you'll understand the logical and physical connections between the RME interface, TotalMix, and Cubase. I am going to cover a little bit about looping in hardware effects, but I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds. That will be in a standalone episode, and it will be published at a future date. Let's get to this. I'm clicking on Studio up here, and I'm going to click on Studio Setup. Under VST Audio System, you can see the device driver, which is the ASIO Fireface USB. You can see my latency times. I've got them pretty low. Yes, that does put a pretty big strain on my CPU, and it can affect memory as well. But I like the snappiness of when I'm playing, having low latency. So it's something I'm willing to live with. If we click here on the ASIO Fireface USB, we'll get to see our logical and physical inputs and outputs. As far as the inputs are concerned, these relate to the physical inputs on the RME interface. And you can see, if you've stuck with me through this whole video, you can see they're essentially named the same as the default names in TotalMix. By clicking on this window button here, we can say whether or not they're visible to us. I believe if you turn them off, you save a little bit of RAM and some CPU. I like them all on. That brings us to the outputs. This is a little bit more confusing. These outputs are not referring to the physical outputs on the RME, at least not specifically. What they're referring to is that middle line on the TotalMix interface. Let me go back there and explain this. Here we are looking at TotalMix again. And what I'm referring to is this middle set of faders here. These are the software playback faders, and they're the software playback channels. You can see that Cubase is right here. This is my master stereo output from Cubase, and it's on ADAT 1 and 2. There's 3 and 4. This is 1 and 2. I'll quickly change it so you can see that. There it is, and now it's back to Cubase again. It's very important that you understand that you assign output channels in Cubase to these logical set of outputs. And then you can dynamically assign these outputs to any of the actual physical outputs. If I go to ADAT 7 and 8, this is a physical output. Cubase is not going there. If I plug a cable in here and amplify it and send it to some speakers, I'm not going to hear Cubase because there's no signal coming out. But my front left and front right speakers are going to Cubase. It's very important that you understand that. Just because this is technically coming out on ADAT 1 and 2 doesn't mean it has to be on ADAT 1 and 2. This is actually ADAT 9, 10, 11. And if you were with me from the start and you watched the portion on TotalMix, you know that this is going to a MOTU from the RME via ADAT, and then it's being converted to analog, and then it's going to the speakers. All right, let's go back into Cubase now and finish Cubase up. So just remember, these outs are going to that middle line of faders, which are a middle line of outputs, and then you can dynamically assign them to the physical outputs. Let's go back to Studio and look at our audio connections, and we'll look at inputs. Here we have our audio inputs, and these inputs over here are real inputs from the RME interface. Let's look at the chord Kronos. Back when I was using this version of Cubase, the Kronos was coming in on ADAT 3 and 4. I can click on any of these and reassign it. Let's put it on analog 1 and 2. So now it would think that the Kronos is plugged into the analog inputs 1 and 2 on the RME interface. When we click on this, it shows all the other connections that I've already made, so I don't accidentally choose one that something is already using. You see these ones in red? These are my return buses that are coming back into the interface and back into Cubase for my hardware effects. More on that in a moment. We do have presets up here, and I can call up one of the presets, and I only have one that I wrote myself, and it's just called Jeff 1. If I call that up, what it's going to do is it's going to change these inputs back to what they originally were. And now they're back to ADAT 3 and 4. Let's move on to the outputs. The outputs work the same. Just remember that when you're selecting one of these outputs, it's that middle line on the TotalMix software. And then you can dynamically assign that to any of the physical outputs. It's kind of a two-stage process, but it makes it very flexible. You can also have presets here as well. I have one that's just called JP Mains. You can add your own, and when you add them, you can use the plus here to add presets, and you can use the minus to delete them. Lastly, let's look at external effects. And these are my looped in hardware effects. Let me expand these for you really quickly, then I'll talk about them. As an overview, we have just buses like we have on the inputs. These are our buses for the output. We have a PCM81, we have the MPX 500, and we have the VL rack. If we want to add a bus, in the other ones we just right click and then choose it. Here we have to click on this, Add External Effects, and it'll add another bus for you. It'll give you a dialog and you can choose stereo, mono, whatever you're using. So let's take a look at the PCM81 here. We have a send bus 1, and it's a stereo effect, so we have a left and a right, and we're sending it to analog 3 and 4. Remember, this is coming out of Cubase, and it's going into TotalMix, so it's going to appear on that middle line, and we can dynamically assign it anywhere we want. It just so happens it's going to analog 3 and 4 in the software outputs, and I also have that assigned to 3 and 4 in the physical outputs. I wanted to make it easy for myself. And then it's coming back in to the physical inputs, analog 3 and 4. So essentially what happens is this send bus sends it to 3 and 4. Those actually go to physical 3 and 4, which go out of the machine. They go into the inputs of the PCM81. The signal gets processed. Then it comes back into analog inputs 3 and 4 and comes back in to Cubase. And that's really all there is to get this working. Over here we have delay compensation. This is just telling you the round trip time for the signal to go out of Cubase, get processed, and then return to Cubase. Based on the longest round trip time, Cubase will set up delay compensation so that everything is synced. That's pretty much it. If you're really interested in an in-depth explanation of hooking up external hardware effects, I'll go through the physical connections, and I'll do a video that's very much like this one with lots of detail. Just like the Studio Tour 2024, that was intense. Everything is set up, everything appears to be working as it should. I'll publish a follow-up episode about 40 days from now about my workflow experience. I've got to tell you that I feel optimistic. I'm not sure why I didn't try this again sooner. I'm wondering if it failed when I tried it twice before because, number one, I had way too much gear to eloquently connect everything, but my recent studio purge took care of that. Number two, my focus has changed from a 50-50 mix of songwriting, demo production, and scoring to 90% scoring. And number three, I hadn't seriously thought about using an iPad with the TotalMix app to control the interface, and I foresee it as a huge plus. I'm not naive about the possibility of problems occurring over the next 30 days, perhaps even serious problems. It's probably inevitable. As they happen, and no matter how small they are, I'm going to make note of them so I can discuss them in the follow-up episode. Remember, even though I'm using an RME UFX, there are other audio interfaces, and many of them have an app like TotalMix. Whether they are as flexible with wireless remote control, I don't know. My point here is that even though I'm using an RME UFX, a lot of what I've gone over today is going to be applicable to the process of setting up other interfaces to go mixerless. If you've gone mixerless or have always been mixerless, feel free to share your experience in the comments. That's pretty much it for now. Time to compose some music and see how this works out. Thanks for watching. Wish me luck. Take care, and I'll be back in another episode soon.